Good afternoon, uh, dignitaries on the dais and in the audience, and organizers. Thanks for having me. The session today was on steel trade, and what I saw in the list of speakers is that there were people who were much more qualified to speak on this than me. So what I have done is I have taken a small niche and in terms of trade, and I'm going to be speaking on ferrous scrap trade, and maybe this has implications on the raw material side. So I thought that usually gets ignored in various events, so I thought I would rather speak on that. Uh, is there a let's enter? All right. So. Briefly speaking, if you look at the scrap trade volume around the world, it has been range bound. It reached up to 113 during the heydays of 2011-12, and then it has again come back to close to 90. So broadly, you can say that we have been range bound in that 90 to 100 million tons per annum for the last 10 years. And the major exporting nations are displayed over here in terms of maroon color, and the importing nations over here are in terms of green color. Two or three important points. The biggest, and I will just give you a little bit of more detail. The biggest importer of ferrous scrap is generally Turkey, and most of you might know that. India is a very big importer of ferrous scrap, but the more important point is that China is way down here. At one point in time, China used to import as much as 13 million tons, but now China imports only about 2 million tons of ferrous scrap. This is an important point that in today's day and age, going back to that particular image, you see that it doesn't count as a major trade player insofar as ferrous scrap is concerned. But going forward, what we see is that you might be aware that post the Olympics and post the Asian Games in China, we have seen a reduction in the frenzy of infrastructure build out. Today, China has cut back even on a lot of IF capacities because of pollution issues. Whereas on the other hand, the growth that they had done over the last, let me say, from 1991 to 2003, one wave, but the second big wave from 2003 onwards. So from 2003 to 2000, say 10-11, whatever growth they had seen in terms of infrastructure, as well as I would say automobile, etc., that growth, I mean, it's going to come home to roost between now and 2030. So automotives that were sold in huge numbers or infrastructure that was created in huge numbers in that period of time, automotives and white goods, whatever, they end their life between now and 2030. So all of that is going to come back in the form of scrap, whereas the consumption in China itself of scrap is going to go down because they are shutting down all these highly polluting units like IFs and EFs, so on and so forth. Not so much EF, but mainly IF. And China's peak capacity has actually reduced quite significantly. That's what we understand, which may be which is significant at least by Indian standards, even though by Chinese standard it is a very small amount. But nonetheless, what we see is that this means that significant generation of scrap is going to happen in China. And if I look at the consumption of scrap within China, you see that even if I consider higher feed rates in blast furnace, in BOF as well as in EF route, even if we assume higher feed rates, the consumption of scrap in China is going to remain in that 250 million tons per annum kind of range, whereas generation of scrap might go up to close to 350 million ton plus. So approximately 100 million tons per annum of scrap will be surplus in China. That is what I see going forward by 2030. 100 million tons of surplus scrap means it could have significant impact around the world. It could. I'm not saying that it will, but it could. And the only thing that stands between the availability of surplus scrap in China and its impact on the global, let me say, raw material market is the supply chain cost. So it is one thing to have a lot of scrap available. It is another thing to shred it, compact it, bale it, transport it, and make it available in the countries which need scrap. So I think that is one point. We still don't know which way it is going to turn, but 100 million tons of or 150 million tons of additional scrap means there are definitely some impact on iron ore and coking coal industry, even if, or rather even on high grade steam coal, which is used for sponge iron production. So it might impact. So the main point that we have to really watch out for is that whether China's increased or surplus availability of scrap is going to make China a net exporter of scrap. Okay, as of now, China is a very marginal player, 2 million ton. 2 million ton to 100 million ton is a massive jump. And if it turns out to be an effective net exporter, which is a function of price, supply chain cost, etc., it's a difficult thing. It is not easy. It is not necessarily that, I will again repeat, that excess availability does not mean excess trade, but that is a risk. And simultaneously, all countries will also be generating scrap. India itself, I think the demand for scrap is going to go up to, I mean, the national steel policy projections are higher in terms of demand for scrap, but we believe that it will be sub 60 million ton per annum by 2031-32. So that India's scrap availability will also increase. And scrap is a very, what shall I say, the trading margins on scrap are very small. Unlike, let me say, for instance, on iron ore or coking coal, the margins are very small. So it is very difficult to sustain high logistics cost. So which is why I think even though availability of scrap will be very high in China, that does not, I think Indian scrap will be more favorable for Indian, let me say, EAF and IF players than, let me say, Chinese scrap. But government can actually play havoc in the whole system. In fact, I think government also needs to play some role in ensuring the direction which industry takes. For instance, if I look at what actions can government potentially take to influence scrap demand. So if government mandates higher feed rates or lower energy intensity in the steel sector, then that might lead to higher demand for scrap as against sponge iron, or let me say, as against sponge iron, for instance. If the government puts stricter quality control requirements, like especially limits the phosphorus content in steel, then sponge iron may get negatively impacted and scrap may get positively impacted. If the government also increases the electricity cost, then that will also influence, that could potentially influence the scrap demand. If environment emission norms are tightened in India, then again IF players will be disadvantaged. But on the other hand, power being low, power consumption being low, that is again a positive for scrap. So I think there are lots of things which the government can do, and not necessarily Ministry of Steel. It could be some other ministry like Ministry of Power. There are many things the government can do between now and 2030 which might impact demand for scrap. Or might end up doing perhaps for a different purpose, and the unintended consequence may be on scrap. Similarly, if I look on at the supply side, if the government expands the scope of the vehicle scrapping policy, that will again impact the domestic availability of scrap. If the government, for instance, promotes further expansion of ship breaking in this particular country, that again changes the picture, right? So I think over the next few years, what we see is that there are many levers through which the demand and supply of scrap or the price of scrap in this country might get affected. Of course, if a lot of this Chinese scrap which is available does not find it economically viable to land up in India or in other countries, then obviously those will go into landfill. or to the extent they will be consumed by domestic sector. But I think it is important for us to watch out for whether China is turning into a net exporter. Broadly, I will say that currently the existing capacity in this country is about 130 million tons of crude steel capacity. And we have set a target of 300 million ton per annum, which definitely is a very high target. But if I even look at domestic demand by the year 2030, domestic demand is expected to be 230 million ton or so, something like that. If I exclude 300, even if we hit 230 million ton, so I would say that we have 100 million ton per annum of steel capacity expansion that is going to happen between now and 2030. Now the decision of this 100 million ton of steel capacity expansion, that will and should be influenced by the availability outlook on scrap. For instance, China, if you see the Chinese economy, a significant part of the Chinese economy growth has been in terms of port-based development, coastal development. So Chinese scrap does not need to travel huge distance from the hinterland to the ports. They are available near the ports. So Chinese scrap generation, significant part, I mean, hinterland is also there, but significant part is also near the port. So essentially, the only cost the Chinese scrap will need to kind of go through is actually not the domestic transport leg, but the processing leg and maybe the ocean freight leg. So, which means that this 100 million ton per annum of steel capacity expansion in India, if it is in the coastal kind of belt, then it can be a, let me say, significant disruptor. And I don't know what step the government is going to do. Government can potentially try to influence this, or the government can let the sector evolve as it is. But the sector players are well advised to look at the Chinese scrap situation. So for instance, there are lots of advantages of BF-BOF route. And but if, for instance, see, why did a lot of this sponge iron units locate themselves in Chhattisgarh? They located themselves in Chhattisgarh because of hopeful, which did not turn out to be so true, availability of coal of a certain high grade. But it didn't turn out to be true. Now, if scrap were to suddenly become available in, let me say, in the coastal region at an economical price, then I think it makes sense to even consider that as an option. I think we have to really see whether going forward, whether the steel units, what kind of technology choices they make, what kind of scale choices they make, whether they want to set up large 3 million ton, 6 million ton large units, or there will also be a small portion of very small units, which is sub 1 million ton, or maybe sub 3 million ton, which is significantly, let me say, scrap based, that we have to really see. But I hope I have been able to seed the thoughts of what choices are available in front of us for this expansion of this 100 million tons and if I take 300 million tons of capacity, then it goes up to 170 million tons of capacity expansion in steel. So scrap will play a role in it. The other important point, the last point I would like to say, I think I'm through with my presentation, but the last point I would like to say is that in physics, there is a thing called as an observer effect. So observer effect, it essentially says that the act of measuring something tends to change the thing that you're measuring. Right? So for instance, if you place some instruments, etc., to measure some phenomenon, that phenomenon itself might get disturbed. So I think I would like to kind of set the cat amongst the pigeons, so to speak, to say that this is an issue. We need to watch out. And when the world is watching this, including India, when it starts watching whether China is turning into a net exporter from being a very marginal player, I think that act itself of watching China, insofar as scrap is concerned, that itself might determine the direction in which maybe ministry takes or some other government takes, and the players individually in this room and outside the room they take. So the final picture may be completely different from what we know. So that's all. Let's watch out. That's the only thing I would like to say. And there is a serious risk that this might happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Niladri.